Hello, how's everyone doing today? I'm here with special guest Bruce Benson. Bruce Benson is an economist. He teaches at Florida State University, specializes in economic incentives in law. He is the author of one of my favorite books, The Enterprise of Law. He's also writes for the Independent Institute. How are you doing this evening?
Good. If a private firm, say a private security firm, has employees who abuse people in the local mall, the security firm is going to get sued and probably go bankrupt if it doesn't do something about that kind of behavior. I suspect that's a lot more significant constraint on behavior than the various kinds of rules that have developed out of the Constitution to constrain the public police. Public police abuse is rampant, as we're hearing repeatedly now on the news. People don't trust the public police. They feel like the public police are discriminating and so on. You don't hear that kind of stuff about private security firms, yet there are probably 3 times as many private security personnel in the United States than there are public police. So I think the idea that the state somehow provides a better kind of law is just something that has been propagated by people in the state who have advantages granted to them through the state's law. And it simply isn't true. Private arbitration resolves a huge majority of all contract disputes in the United States and around the world. Public courts don't. People write contracts to get out of the public courts in order to go to private arbitration, or they use private mediation. And so it's just a myth that the state should and does provide all law, a myth that I'm trying to bust, and that's a major goal of my research today.
Mm-hmm. Well, so don't you think the people who use all these private services have an incentive, like, to tell more people, like if it's the case that people are increasingly irritated with the public services and use private services, then why wouldn't that information just get out? Why wouldn't people realize, hey, these private services are better, and this is just, nonsense?
Well, it is getting out in the relevant communities. Most businessmen know that they want to use arbitration. The communities where private security is allowed, recognize, of course, that across the country, various states have various kinds of regulations that limit the use of private security and limit competition in the private security market and so on. Think of one example is in San Francisco. Back in the gold rush period, a private security system developed in San Francisco which is still in place today. This security system are individuals and firms that contract with local businessmen or homes to watch their property, check the locks when they're on vacation, all those sorts of things. The public police have been trying to get rid of that system for decades because they think it's taking away their jurisdiction. And it also, of course, takes away some of their private business, because lots of public police moonlight as private security, and they get paid typically a lot more than the private security personnel who are not public police. So they want to protect their own turf, both as enforcers of the law and as security for individual consumers. So you hear lots of bad stuff about private security. Anytime something happens, and there's going to be problems in any industry. There's going to be individuals who screw up or are abusive of their authority and so on. Anytime you hear something like that, it really gets played up. I did a talk for the Midwest Attorney General Association, state attorney generals, a while back, and I was talking about privatization, and they also brought in a representative of the union representing prison guards. Their idea of privatization, of course, was contracting with private firms, such as prison providers. And this union representative talked about how dangerous the job was and how his members needed big wages and all that sort of stuff because of prison riots and all those kinds of problems. But then he attacked a particular private prison because 3 individuals had escaped, and they were dangerous individuals. And he didn't say anything about the fact that people escape from public prisons too, but he said after his discussion of this incident, he said, the state will never contract with that firm again. And my response was, exactly, that's what's good about the market. You don't have to buy somebody's services if they're bad. You don't renew that contract. Try to get out of a contract with a public prison guard union. You can't hardly close public prison because of the protests of the guards. There are lots of people in government and contracting perhaps with government who want you to believe that they have to be the source of law. And they seem to get the ear of the press a lot more effectively than successful examples of private security or private adjudication and so on.
Right. Yeah, I agree. And I think also, I mean, obviously one benefit I think is that you'd have significant lower victimless crimes because you would actually have to pay out of your own pocket to enforce these laws. Where now you just have to check your marks on a ballot, and the costs are socialized to everyone.
Yeah, in a private customary law system, it's usually up to the victim or his family or support group to pursue prosecution, and the goal of prosecution generally is compensation for harms. In that sort of situation, acts that don't have victims aren't illegal. You got to have somebody victimized before it becomes an offense. So all of these victimless crimes that we have today would be out the window, and all the resources devoted to pursuing and punishing those perpetrators of victimless crimes would be saved for other purposes.
Right. Yeah, that's true. And of course, you know, as you've written, police obviously have many incentives to pursue, the drug war. They reap a share of the profits from civil asset forfeiture. It's really corrupt.
Yeah, I've actually done a fair amount of work on police incentives in the drug war, and certainly the civil asset forfeiture issue is a big one that our empirical research suggests police have increased their focus on drug crime since laws were passed that allowed them to keep the proceeds of seizures in drug crimes. Of course, that's got so lucrative that police now can keep proceeds from other kinds of seizures as well, but very few illegal activities are as lucrative as the drug market. So there's a lot more money in boats and airplanes and things like that to seize in the drug market than there are in other areas of crime. And one consequence of that actually has been that more policing and punishment resources are devoted to drug crime, results in reduction in enforcement of other kinds of laws. And so we find that non-drug crimes, violent and property crimes, are higher because of drug enforcement than they would be if drugs were legalized.
Right, right, and also probably even if you would have, let's say, these things. I mean, now you have sort of just the tragedy of the commons, where whoever calls the police first, the police comes, and not based on order of importance, which Price and Mecken get out. Cool.
I didn't catch all of that, but one thing about the market is that the market prioritizes pretty well. People who are willing to pay the most for something get it, and of course willingness to pay suggests that they think that particular service or item is very valuable relative to people who aren't willing to much. Of course, you get the counter argument always that the private sector is biased in favor of the wealthy and against the poor. But if you look at the allocation of police resources across neighborhoods, who's being protected and who's being pursued and arrested and harassed, it doesn't look like the public police really shift that preference at all, and may actually shift it in the other direction. There's a company here in Florida that started up by going to landlords with who had low-income housing and offering to provide them with private security, suggesting that they would prevent vandalism and crimes against their tenants and so on. That company was so successful that it soon expanded from its $2,000 startup funds to several $1 million with offices in several big cities where they provide security for low-income people, and as a consequence, crime rates tend to fall by up to 50% in those low-income communities. The tenants stay longer, there's less turnover, there's less property damage, all those sorts of good things for the landlords, so they're willing to pay for it. And the tenants are happy and better off than they would be if they were relying on public police.
Mm-hmm. Very good. So you spoke a little about earlier how that a law originally evolved spontaneously and was private. So can you maybe explain a little how did government monopolize it? How is government able to take control of that and have it shifted?
Through coercion. The government process of absorbing the law is pretty slow if we look through history. In England, for instance, after the Norman conquest, so we're talking, how many centuries ago, 1066, the king seized all property, said it was all his, and then sort of doled it out to supporters. At that time, victims were responsible for pursuit of offenders. But in the process of doing away with these privately held properties in these local communities and so on, taking all that. And then the king started saying, well, in certain circumstances, the compensation being paid by offenders goes to the king. So if there's an offense on the public highways, the compensation goes to the king, not the victim. Not a big deal, because a lot of the people on the public highways were foreign merchants and that sort of thing anyway, and so local people didn't get too upset about it. And then the king says, well, the king is also going to protect people during certain special times of the year, Christmas, that sort of thing. So if there's an offense committed during those times, the king gets compensated. And of course, the local lord would claim a chunk of the compensation payment if he got involved. And anyway, as the king tried to shift the system from one of compensation to victims to fines or paid to the king, or property seizures going to the king, the local communities rebelled, not in the sense of violent revolution. They simply stopped doing the policing duties. So the king couldn't collect his money. And so he started ordering these private communities to carry out their policing duties, and ordering victims to prosecute offenders, even though the money was going to go to the king. And they resisted and refused. And there's a long history of developments where the king creates various institutions to try to force local communities to collect these monies for him, in order to satisfy victims who were not being compensated. He started instituting all sorts of physical kinds of punishment, hanging and all those sorts of things. And so over time, he's undermined the incentives of the private sector to do these things, and has, as a result, had to develop public or quasi-public institutions like public police to do the stuff for him. They get more and more expensive, of course, and ultimately it turns into just a really expensive process, no longer generating revenues for the state. But the whole first several centuries of the development was really for the state to collect revenues through this process, and take those revenues or compensation payments away from victims through coercive power. Now we have a very different system, of course, very expensive, huge tax revenues going into it, and so on. And I can talk about why that happened too, if you want to. But
go ahead.
One big factor, actually, in England, for instance, was the process of jury nullification. As the king, actually, the term crime developed around, I'm going to say, the 1200s. And the term referred to offenses where the money goes to the king, as opposed to civil offenses where the money went to the victim. And so as crime becomes more and more important, and the king has to, in order to try to placate the victims and their families and so on, punish these criminals, they pass or mandates more and more capital punishment. Minor offenses, the punishment was death. Local juries just were not willing to hand out death penalties to individuals who had committed some sort of minor kind of theft or something like that. And so the alternative to death was essentially branding as a thief and being let loose, because there were no prisons or anything like that. And so the juries refusing to hang everybody decided that they were going to just convict people of lesser offenses so they would not be killed by the state. And this increasingly became a problem. You got all these, I guess, ex-cons running around that were not being dealt with, and you also, and so you have demands by various groups for the state to do something about it. The merchants in London, for instance, had their own police force, but when the king or the government offered to take it over and pay the police, naturally the merchants were fine with that. As long as you're going to enforce our law, you can pay for it. That's great. And so that kind of activity goes on. And there's demands for something all other than capital punishment for criminals. The state didn't want to spend money doing it. And so the first activity for that was transportation. They shipped all their offenders off to Georgia and places like that in the colonies. They didn't have to pay for that. They contracted it out. They gave special franchise to a company to haul these prisoners over to England, and they were, over to the colonies, and they could collect money by selling indentured servitudes in the colonies. So transportation starts replacing capital punishment. Well, the American Civil Revolution sort of put a damper on that. So you got all these people who were scheduled for transportation, but they couldn't transport them. They started in on these hulks, they called them ships, in the Thames River, where they'd put them in striped uniforms and make them do hard labor, dredging the river and so on. And you get all the sorts of things we think about with the old-time prisons, prisoners being whipped and those sorts of things. And so you get prison riots, people escaping from the hulks, demands to do something about that. Ultimately, in the 1800s, they started building prisons to actually house these individuals. There was a period, of course, where they transported offenders to Australia as well, trying to avoid actually building prisons. But ultimately, the government decided, well, we're going to have to pick up this tab because people are just too upset about it. Part of the crime problem, of course, was that every time England went to war, after the war was over, the troops would come back and just be released with no real jobs or job training other than training in violence. And so these troops would form gangs in the cities, criminal gangs, and the private sector could protect certain areas like the docks in London and so on. But the demand was for the state to do something about these criminals that the state essentially was creating by training them in violence. And so you get a number of things coming together, along with, of course, what public finance economists call the revolution in public finance, the ability to start collecting other kinds of taxes for the state that allowed them to turn away from criminal law as a source of revenues and ultimately start financing all this stuff. And it's a long process that really traces all the way back to the Normans' demand that those revenues go to them instead of victims, and you set off this process of local communities quitting their policing functions, the state trying to force it, the state then ultimately coming up with alternative ways of collecting revenues. The reward system, for instance, was developed by the state to pay for the capture of highwaymen. But that was a problem because it created incentives for people to falsely accuse others of committing crimes, and so you get these various scandals of false accusations to collect rewards. People get upset about that. You get sort of a contracting out for public police. The first public police in England were, or I guess the first police-like organization in England was privately financed, essentially through collecting rewards and things like that, but it had public sanction. It was run by the local justice of the peace, and then they decided to actually pay police in the area of London where Parliament is, not any place else, but they did form a public police program in the area where parliamentarians were living and so on. And others demand this same sort of thing, and you know, through a long sort of gradual process with no real direction to it in the minds of the people doing it, you end up with the mess we have today.
Right. Yeah, because it seems like from reading your book and what you're saying now that like prisons may not even really exist. Like it seems like like pretty much everyone would just want like who is victim to pay a tort.
Hmm.
But you think that's the case also for like if someone's the victim of rape or murder, you don't think they would want that person in prison, or?
Well, I guess it depends on how much they get compensated. But if I mean, one thing that occurred during that period where compensation was the norm was that violent offenders, serious offenders, might not be able to pay compensation, but they had as an alternative indentured servitude. So those individuals could work off their debt. A lot of times, of course, you might not want to work for somebody you victimize because they might take advantage of having you as essentially a slave. But in many cases, these contracts, these indentured servitude contracts, would be sold to somebody else who want labor services rather than some sort of punishment, so the victim would get his compensation that way. I could envision certainly prison kinds of environments where individuals are under contract to pay compensation, and a private firm is running some sort of production process in this prison-like environment. We have prison industries programs all over the place now, and people work off their debt that way. I suspect it would be contractual, that the victim would say, "Look, if you don't sign up to be supervised, to be constrained in some way so that I can believe that you're going to try to pay me, then we're not going to make a deal here, and my family is going to go after you," or something like that. Violence, the threat of violence underlies all law. It's back there, and it can always pop up in the absence of an agreement or adjudication or something like that. So offenders, I suspect, would be much more likely to agree to some sort of indentured servitude kind of arrangement in order to pay debt than be threatened by death. Now, I don't see that nearly as the use of imprisonment nearly as heavily as we see it now. Of course, many of the people in prison are there for victimless crimes. But violent offenders and people like that, if it appears that they're not going to flee, but they're going to actually try to work off their debt, some sort of halfway house program or electronic monitoring or something like that might be agreed to. If they flee, we would have a market like the bail bondsman market today, where bounty hunters go after them and do so much more effectively than the public police do, by the way. So there might be prison-like environments. I think they're going to be focused on generating restitution. A serial killer or somebody like that could never pay off their debt, but if they're locked up and they're working and their income is largely going to their victims, it seems like a lot more sensible system than what we have today, where they're locked up on death row for 15 years or something before all the cases go through the courts that cost $1 million or so to get somebody killed through the process. Instead of spending a lot of money, the process starts generating money as individuals are put to work. It's not a perfect system. There's going to be bad guys that aren't going to respond to the incentives. There's going to be people. I have a paper in the Independent Review recently where I talked about how the private sector might handle what I called as martyrs, madmen, and I can't remember the other word I used, people who just refuse to work. And, you know, it's hard to imagine, but the market is extremely responsive to needs, and I suspect that something will come up that even somebody like me who's studied the issue for a long time can't visualize.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, very good. No, because when reading the book, one of the things that I thought was very interesting in the enterprise of the law is that under a private system, the victims feel like they're actually compensated, where now they feel like not only does this person victimize me, but I have to actually pay for his compensation and food and clothing, and so I'm not victim. I'm not compensated at all. I'm a victim twice.
Yeah. Interestingly, in the U.S. and actually several other countries now, there are programs developing like victim offender mediation, where the idea is to put the victim and the offender in a room with a mediator, and other people might be there too, family members and so on, and they mediate a contract. They come up with a contract about how the offender is going to make up for what he's done. And, it might be money, but there was one example where a kid agreed to mow somebody's lawn for a year. There's all sorts of things that might be sufficient compensation, especially for minor crimes. And these victim offender mediation programs, roughly over 90% of the actual mediations are successful in generating contracts. Roughly 95% of the contracts are fulfilled. This certainly can work. Most of the experiments have been with juveniles or relatively minor crimes, but increasingly they're dealing with more and more severe crimes with success. So even today we see this private alternative cropping up regularly, and I would suggest because of dissatisfaction with the state's process.
Cool. So one of the things that I've heard a lot of people say is, that sounds good, I guess, when it's a one-on-one, when you have one guy victimize another guy. But let's say in the case, how would this work in terms of collective damage? Like when you need an army, how is just private companies possibly defensive enough against the military might of a country? And aren't they just going to, with a government, since wouldn't their defense just be overproduced, so they're more secure against protection? Where in the market, people might not want to pay enough for a military. So isn't that a problem?
Well, yeah. As my friend David Friedman says, defense is always the big issue. Defense against other sources of organized corruption, organized coercion. And it is difficult to visualize private defense, although certainly in, say, during the American Revolution, the War of 1812, most of the naval activity was private, privateers going out and attacking British ships for the loot they could collect, or attacking American ships for the loot they could collect. So there are certainly those kinds of opportunities. We also see huge so-called security markets with people contracting with state governments now to participate in their warfare in Afghanistan and Iraq and places like that. But as long as there is a state, perhaps a state is inevitable. I don't know. I hope not. But I mean, if there's one state, it's going to force other communities to organize defense. And once they do that, once you organize coercive power, it's going to be misused. And so they may move into the legal process as well. I've spent my career, or a good deal of it, looking at the legal process and saying there's nothing about the legal process that has to be done by the state. I haven't looked at the issue of defense closely. That's a cop-out, I know, but I think it really is the big problem, because we don't have examples of current private communities being defended by the market. And historically, I mean, you can think of things that sort of were quasi-private communities. The city-states in Italy during the Renaissance period, the cities in the Netherlands during their rapid growth and commercialization were largely independent and run by merchants and bankers, and they did have certainly armies and all those sorts of things. But I would say that I wouldn't say that's truly a private system, because certainly they also had some coercive power.
Mm-hmm. No, I agree. I mean, the only thing that I can think of sort of saying is, you know, you have countries now that don't really have a military, like Monaco, which are safe, and also, why is having a military a guarantee that you're safe? I mean, isn't just a big old military mean that you're in trouble? I mean, Canada has a government, but if the United States decided to attack them, they're screwed. So the fact that they have an army is not a sufficient deterrence against a government, as long as that other government has more powerful army, right?
Yeah, and of course we have, like Costa Rica doesn't have an army,
right.
But essentially they have an agreement with the United States to protect them. The big government, if you've got a big sort of world policeman like the United States wants to be, you might be able to get rid of a lot of local armies, but that gives a lot of power to the United States then to push people around. You know, how we would I read a really fun science fiction article, or I mean, short story a while back that had lots of sort of neat imagined security devices and so on. But one example that I thought was really clever, this guy, this was an area supposedly in the middle of the United States that had gone anarchy, essentially. They had private police forces, private contract police services, and so on. And these police services had a contract with each other to defend against outsiders if they were invaded. But when the state decided to invade, those police services just weren't big enough or strong enough to prevent the invasion. And so the invading troops go in, and there's this one individual who hadn't signed up with any police services. He had his property surrounded by all sorts of protection and so on. The army busts through and gets up on top of this hill in this guy's property, and suddenly something pops up out of the ground, and it's a nuclear bomb that this individual had, and explodes and kills this huge force of state army. And then the story goes on and says, as this army continues to try to take over this territory, they keep running into these crazy guys with nuclear weapons, and finally they give up and pull out. The idea of nuclear weapons in the hands of government or private individuals is scary, but it was an imaginative story about how, with technological advances, it might be possible for deterrence to be generated by private individuals or private organizations.
Oh, very nice. And so it'll probably just, I mean, so do you imagine getting more and more privatization is what? I guess just gradually, or people, like, I'm really happy about this New York thing because arrests have gone down, but so has crime. I mean, hopefully people will take the right lesson and look at this as a model by saying, you know,
Yeah.
maybe.
Yeah, it's hard to imagine the kinds of things happening that we as libertarians think should happen, and yet they do. I mean, I never dreamed that I would see legalization of marijuana in my lifetime. We're starting to see it, obviously. Highly regulated, but nonetheless it's occurring. I never dreamed that the Soviet Union would fall apart. It did. I can envision how private security could take over all policing and that sort of thing. It's hard to imagine it happening, but I hope I'm surprised.
Me too. All right. Well, thanks for coming on. It was very interesting. And hope to do this again.
Okay, thanks.
All right. Take care.
You too.